Thank you so much, John. And thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Marwa Hassanan, and I am a member of the Education Committee and also a member of the Board of Directors of the Maine Multicultural Center. I am pleased and honored today to introduce my dear brother, a good friend, and one of my favorite leaders here in Maine. He truly elevates others and amplifies our voices and really lifts us all. So I'm very, very happy and grateful that he accepted our invitation tonight. To tell you a little bit about this wonderful man, Reza Jalali is a noted writer, educator, immigrant advocate, and former refugee from Iran. He was recently appointed executive director of the Greater Portland Immigrant Welcome Center, a nonprofit organization that serves as a hub for organizations and individuals to collaborate in helping Maine's thriving immigrant community reach its civic, economic, and social potential. Additionally, a prolific author of The Immigrant Experience, Reza's forthcoming book, Dear Maine, The Trials and Triumphs of Maine's 21st Century Immigrants, will be available in September 2021. Congratulations. Jalali's other books include New Mainers, Moon Watchers, and Homesick Mosque and Other Stories. His children's book, Moon Watchers, has received the Stepping Stone MultiCultural Award. His 5-act play, The Poets and the Assassin, which is about women in Iran and Islam, has been staged to rave reviews across New England. Jalali's storytelling was also featured on National Public Radio's popular program, The Moth Radio Hour. And I present to you, Reza Jalali.
Thank you so much, Marwa. Thank you. It's so kind to me, and I'm honored to be here. I'm feeling humbled. And so I always talk about the whole issue of immigration in Maine. I term it as a love and hate relationship. In Maine, we seem to love immigration. We know it's good for us. We know that our very survival as a state depends on how welcoming and accepting we could be with the newcomers. At the same time, we don't like immigrants, it seems. We don't like to, some of us, not all, of course, we don't like them to live next door to us, or we have all this kind of myths about them. So this is love and hate relationship. Historically, that has been true in Maine, that we preferred one group of immigrants to another, and then the tough times came, and of course we blamed the immigrants and all the name calling and so on and so forth. So some of the things you're going to do tonight is unlearning some of those myths. And I'll make an attempt this evening to provide you with an accurate picture of who New Mainers are. And in the process also, I would, of course, talk about the experiences of those who arrived before us, the past immigrants, the Irish, the Italians, the French Canadians, the Jews, the Armenians, and so on and so forth. Because to me, the arrival of the new Syrian refugees from Burma, Myanmar, we're receiving some refugees in the Greater Portland area, is a natural continuation of this American story that started centuries ago. And this is the story of America. This is the core of the American narrative, that people come to America to be part of this magic, this symphony that we call America, each coming, contributing, and adding to the richness and beauty and magic of this symphony. And some come by choice, some come, they're forced out of their homelands, some are pulled, some are drawn, and some are pushed out of their homelands, and they come here in search of human dignity and safety. So the view of Maine's people as a monolithic society is quite misleading, I would argue. For they are the indigenous population, of course, immigrants from different parts of Europe and beyond, in colonial times and after, Americans from other parts of the US, other immigrants those brought into the new land as slaves, and refugees, migrant workers, summer residents, foreign students. Their presence, in short, has contributed to the texture and color of the canvas of Maine society. Of course, we need to note here that the story of peopling of Maine cannot be told without acknowledging the unpeopling of Maine as well. And in order to make room for the newcomers, the original people, the first people, were forced out. Following British victory in colonial wars, we all know that Acadian exclusion sent refugees far from their homes. It's to acknowledge the indigenous population that I am starting today's conversation with these words. I recognize that I'm standing on land that was stolen from its original owners. I recognize and honor the current tribes who make up the Wabanaki Confederacy. They have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We should pause and respect the traditional values of these tribes. I pray for their cultural healing and recovery. So, with that acknowledgement, let's talk about all those who came, because I would argue, unless you are a member of the Wabanaki, you are an immigrant. All of us came here as immigrants. Different times, by different means, we arrived. Some of us walked here, some of us came by train. Some were forced, some were stolen in Africa and brought as slaves to this land, but we all made it here. Over the generations, immigrants have come to Maine for a variety of reasons: economic opportunities, fleeing wars, fleeing violence in Europe in cases of Jewish refugees, Armenians, the conflicts in their homeland, the political and religious persecution, and add to that, mind you, this is climate change. Economic difficulties, famine in the homeland, or the appeal of Maine's natural beauties, safety, great schooling system, its wilderness, and some have come for love, marriage, and adventure, among others. The French and English were the first groups eager to exploit economic opportunities in Maine. This goes back to the 15th or 16th century. Each group was interested in securing raw materials for their respective nations and also in advancing the colonial agenda and ambitions. So as such, you can imagine these two groups were in competition. We move on, and German arrived in Maine. German immigrants arrived in Maine. Samuel Waldo, the most famous one, recruited about 1,500 German settlers to come and to the Broad Bay area of Maine in the 1750s. And the reasons they came, it has been researched that mostly economic opportunities, religious tolerance. But interestingly, to Waldo and his fellow citizens, other Germans, in colonial Massachusetts Bay, German settlement acted as a buffer between the English and the French along the Maine frontier. And I say that because this is really interesting that some of these early immigrants would bring the conflicts with them to the new land, to the new lives. Then, of course, we have to talk about the Irish. Tadisa Clark was the first known Irishman to settle in Maine in 1662 in what is now Portland. Irish immigrants continued to trickle into Maine until the mid-19th century, when economic depression and the famine, the potato famine, made life a difficult place, made Ireland a difficult place to live. There was misery. The Irish who made up the largest mass migration of refugees that to this day the state of Maine has ever seen. And I say that in response to those who would say, well, we are being overrun by the Somalis, by this group and another. I have to remind them that in terms of the numbers, the Irish still continue to be the largest group who came to Maine. The first wave of Irish immigrants to Maine came in the early 1700s. In fact, it seems allegedly one of the oldest standing Catholic church in New England is the St. Patrick's in Newcastle, Maine. And that's fascinating because it's possible, although doubtful, that the first mosque in the United States might have been in Biddeford, Maine, but we'll get to that later. So it's that between 1845 and 1855, 1.5 million people fled Ireland. The most desperate of them were sent off to North America by landlords who found it cheaper to clear the land of the destitute peasants than to give them relief, to help them, to feed them. Hundreds of such immigrants were packed into ships bound for Canada in overcrowded and cramped quarters. Many of them died in the coffin ships, as they were called, during the 8 to 10 week journeys to the New World. Some of those who arrived in Quebec walked all the way to Maine, that heard about the industrial jobs here waiting for them in the mills. As such, they were drawn and pulled to come to Maine. Many of them were laborers. They worked in the Portland waterfront. I sometimes tell my students that some of the gorgeous churches we have, the beautiful bridges we have in Maine, the libraries, the buildings, the roads were built by the hardworking immigrants of the past. And I'm not surprised that the story continues to this day, that today's immigrants also are contributing to the beauty of Maine, paying the debt in one way to other to this estate. Many of them worked in the mills of Lewiston, Biddeford, and Saco. They helped to build a new state capitol building in Augusta, for example. In Bangor, a new city, they joined the workforce in the booming timber business. And while they were doing that, the wives and daughters took jobs as domestic helpers for the well-to-do families in the cities. I've heard the stories of no Irish need apply. The prejudice against the Irish grew strong in the 1830s in Maine and elsewhere. It was a reaction to the large number of Irish immigrants arriving. Mind you, they were Europeans, but they were the low-income, poorer Europeans, and many of them were illiterate. Fact that they belonged to a different sect of Christianity, they were practicing Roman Catholic, that did not help them. Back then, Maine was, the majority of Christians in Maine were Protestants, and to them, Roman Catholics were not even Christians. So the stories of many stories of religious persecution and racism and sexism basically intolerance of the Irish immigrants, who, mind you, they had escaped all that horror to come to Maine in search of better lives. For example, newspapers of today would report of Irish sections of Maine cities in calling them ugly names. Dublin, quote unquote, in Bangor, an area, neighborhood where the Irish lived, was reported as being rowdy, as being unsafe and dirty. Let's move on to French Canadians who also were Roman Catholic. So the largest number of the 19th century immigrants came from Canada. Again, they were attracted to come to Maine because of the mills and the jobs available and the farms in that part of Canada were not doing that well. In 1910, as much as 75% of the population in some northern and eastern sections of Maine were either foreign-born or first-generation Americans of French Canadian origin. So it's interesting because as victims of prejudice, that the French Canadian families pressured the kids to stop speaking French. And as such, as a society, as a community, as a state, we are paying the price. Just imagine it. We could have had a bilingual state. We could have had a large, significant number of Mainers speaking French, and then the potential for the trade between Maine and our French-speaking neighbors, be it in France, in Europe, or in Canada. We all lost something. The arrival to Maine was really, in many ways, it seems was going to be temporary, that they would earn enough money and then they would go back to their families and start farming the lands. But we all know that the early French Canadians really did not make enough money working in the textile mills to return to Quebec or go back to New Brunswick. This is despite the fact that they worked 14 hours a day, and their children worked, and they worked very hard, but still they could not manage to save enough money to go back. So that was a dream that never really materialized. And there are stories of the French Canadians being forced to live in not so nice areas. In Lewiston, they were discouraged from moving out of their neighborhoods to become neighbors with other people from Lewiston, now French Canadians. And the banks would not offer them loans. And the whole issue of redlining of neighborhoods was going on. So they were crowded into communities known as Petit Canadas, small Canada. And what happened in those communities, there were children, Franco children, who would have grown up not knowing much English. They had limited contact with the English-speaking world. And so the example of in Lewiston, Little Canada, physically cut off from the rest of the city and not having any dealings with the larger community. So there was religious discrimination, as you can imagine, and to many of the established communities who themselves were immigrants, by the way, and the French Canadians really were treated as subhumans, as second-class citizens. So we're talking about French Canadian, but I have to also talk about, I forgot to mention the Irish women and their plight. And in the both pre and post Civil War, when the waves of Irish immigrants arrived, there were many single Irish women They worked as maids, as servants, the few jobs open to them, and cleaning fish, and as well as in tourism, especially in hotels and restaurants. And that reminds me of the clients that I see in our offices. Just the nationalities have changed. In many hotels and resorts across the state of Maine, and all those who clean our rooms, prepare our food, serve the food, do the dishes happen to be new Mainers. And it again reminds me of what I said earlier. This is a continuation of this American story. So there were other immigrants who came, of course, and Finns came, and in the last quarter of the 19th century, Italians came, and they joined the Finns in granite work and moved to Portland and other cities where they worked in construction, among other jobs. One of the untold stories about new Mainers, those who arrived in Maine, continues to be about the Chinese. Chinese immigrants came, although in very, very small numbers, but they came to Maine, and in fact, they were living and working in different parts of the state. The numbers was really, really small. We're talking about less than 200. Perhaps in 1920, the number I could find was fewer than 200. And then there's the Exclusion Act of 1882 by the federal government. Prior to that, really, we didn't have immigration laws. As long as you made it to America, you were fine. There were no forms, there were no applications, there were no interviews. And once the federal government took over the immigration laws, and laws after laws were passed, that we see there's some system in place, and of course it came with racism. So for example, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed because to many, it started really in California, that many community members from California complained that the Chinese labor lowered the wages, and as such impacted them negatively. And so they lobbied, and that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and which reminds me, every time I talk about that, it reminds me of another ban in 2017 in the so-called Muslim travel ban that basically excluded immigrants from few Muslim majority countries. And so I wonder, about 100 years from now, 75 years from now, 200 years from now, how the so-called Muslim travel ban would be talked about, that how really this discriminating against entire nations of some countries across the world. So the Chinese Exclusion Act changed in the 1960s. And as such, as a result, the number of Chinese immigrants coming to Maine increased. And of course, we have to understand that Maine's current Chinese community, I should say American Chinese community, say in Portland, Maine, is significantly different from the immigrants of the past who came from China. The well-educated, the professionals, and that has changed. So in case of Chinese immigrants, the men who already were in the United States physically could stay. But they could not bring their wives and families to America to join them. So in the slides I'm about to show you a while later, you see that most of the images are, in fact, Chinese men and Chinese single men. So even though they had families, they were married, they lived in a bachelor society. one story of a Chinese couple really sticks with me. I co-curated an exhibition in 2013 for the Maine Historical Society in Portland called 400 Years of New Mainer, same title that this talk has. And the story of this Chinese couple that owned and managed a laundromat at the Woodford's Corner, the busy Woodford's Corner on Forest Avenue. There was this gentleman, Mr. Goon. He married someone from China, Toi Len Chin, and she was 29. After marrying her husband, proxy marriage in China, she had to wait 3 years to get permission to join her husband in Portland, Maine, and she arrived here. It's a heartbreaking story because sitting in her village in China, she'd assumed that life in America would come with some glory. So she'd been stitching all these gorgeous, beautiful silk dresses, which in fact the Maine Historical Society has one on display, so had one as part of that exhibition. And thinking that once she gets to Maine, she'll be invited to these magnificent balls and parties and dinners, not knowing that life was going to be very hard. She and her husband worked 12 to 14 hours a day. They lived on top of the laundromat, a usual practice back then. And but her arrival to in America as a married woman, that itself was very rare. And because of, again, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese immigration, was still in place. So every now and then I come across this as part of this, I would say new, it's always been there, but it's quite recent, this anti-immigration sentiment that we see in northern part of the state. And people would say, well, the African immigrants or refugees or asylum seekers who come to Maine, they're all given a free car, they're given houses, they don't have to pay taxes. And the whole thing that we need to unlearn tonight. I always think of the Swedish migration into Maine, the 19th century. There was this gentleman, Mr. Thomas, a Bowdoin College graduate. He was a consulate to Sweden, and his job was to promote immigration to the United States. So Mr. Thomas believed that Swedes were the perfect immigrants to help populate Aroostook County and also keep less desirable immigrants from settling there. So he saw them as hardworking. And so Swedish immigrants, when they started arriving in 1870, would receive tax-free land to establish their farms and all kinds of help they got from the government. To the extent that by 1873, 600 Swedish immigrants had built some 130 homes and they had cleared 1,500 acres for their farms. Then we have the story of Richmond, Maine, when we have a group of Russian exiles setting up a community in the 1950s. And then the Armenians arrived, and it seems by some account that the Armenian community in Maine could be one of the oldest in America. And in Portland, Maine, there's this place behind City Hall that used to be called the Little Armenia. And so there's so much history. The Greeks arrived, and I'm always mindful of the story of this young man, a Greek citizen who arrived in the United States, initially worked in Boston, I think, and then he ended up in Louisiana and he became a police officer. Anthony Petropoulos became very famous because he was a non-white European. If you were to believe that, the Greeks are not whites and considered non-whites, but he was the first police officer of not coming from Northern and Central Europe. So there was so much noise about that. And of course, in the years later, decades later, we had our first Somali young woman wearing the hijab, becoming a police officer in Portland, Maine. And that tells you that we are work in progress, that American experience is continuing. We're evolving, and we keep adding chairs to the table. We keep making room for those who are different than us, all for the right reasons. So then we have, of course, the Jewish refugees fleeing violence, fleeing the Holocaust. But even prior to that, we had Jewish refugees and immigrants arrived in during colonial times. In 1849, Bangor, the city of Bangor, became the state's, hosted the state's first synagogue and its largest Jewish community. Never mind, it was only 6 families. And then the Jews started to arrive in greater numbers beginning in the 1870s. And then, of course, the violence in Europe happened. So, and more Jewish immigrants arrived in Maine in search of, for the same reason that the others had come. And they were also, they faced discrimination, of course. They faced hostilities. By then now we have the KKK being extremely active in Maine, and in absence of African-American communities in Maine. I mean, they were here, African-Americans were here, but the numbers were very, very few. So the KKK and the Know Nothing Party, I'll tell you more about them, they started to target Jews and also immigrants who belonged to, they were Catholics, so the Irish, the Italians, and the French Canadians. They were targeted. And so let's see what else. So, and the Jews, as I said, faced discrimination in hiring. They were unable to buy homes in certain neighborhoods. We were denied membership in many clubs and social organizations. And that, by the way, continued till I think I was in Maine when some of that would come up. And there's a story in Boston Globe, I think 1953, 1954, we made it to the national news that 2/3 of Maine's resorts refused to accept Jewish guests. And so despite these challenges, Jewish Mainers have made significant contribution to the state throughout the 20th century as elected officials, civil servants, and professionals, philanthropists, community leaders. And so just imagine if you can imagine for a moment how poor Maine would have been without the contribution of these immigrants who had come before us. The Know Nothing Party, renamed in 1855 as the American Party and commonly known as the Know Nothing Party. The reason for that name was it was a secretive political party, and the members were asked, what are your platforms? What is this political party about? They were instructed to say, I know nothing about this. That's known as Know Nothing Party. I always chuckle because that's quite a name for a political party. Know nothing, I'm ignorant. And so it operated on a national basis during the 1830 to 1860s. And the Know Nothings, again, they really reacted to the popular fears of the Mainers, or the country that had feeling overwhelmed by immigrants who did not look like them, who did not go to the same church as they did. They were of a different class. They spoke different languages, French, for example. So they found them to be hostile. The assumption was that they were hostile to Republicans' values. I mean, there were things that were being said about some immigrants in Maine that they could never be part of the American society, that they don't have respect for democracy, and so on and so forth, all false. The same sentences, in some cases word for word, were said about the French Canadians, the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, the Armenians. So, and they were quite violent, the Know Nothing Party, and membership was limited to Protestant men. Women were not allowed. And in Maine, they're known as, for the one particular incident, I think it's 1882, that they burned down a Roman Catholic church in Bath, Maine, Old South Church. So this was a mob of Know Nothing Party members who, the level of intolerance and hatred, I mean, we can't think of that now in 2021, that a group of people would go and burn down an actual church. And the images of that there's a painting that the Maine Historical Society has. So I'm sure many of you have seen that terrible image of a church being burned down. And of course, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which was formed in 1915, a time of high nationalism, nativism, economic anxiety about that they were losing their quote unquote values. Maine residents joined the secret movement in large numbers. Many Mainers are surprised to hear that some of their own ancestors were actually members of the KKK. And so they had a headquarters on Forest Avenue in Portland. And by 1923, the Klan reported or claimed a statewide membership of 20,000. And they were so mainstream that the daily newspapers of the time would, in fact, as part of the society column, they would report on the dinners and social events, open to family and children, by the way, organized by the Klan. So, or the stories of firefighters, police officers, joining the Klan marches through the streets, many streets of many cities across the state. So I wanted to stop here and first of all, see if you have any questions. I should have said this in the beginning, that we are going to be very informal tonight. And so please feel free to interrupt me. And if you have any questions, we are going to also have some time for question and answer. But please, if you have something that you need me to clarify, I would be happy to respond. And because we're on Zoom, I'm going to pause for a few seconds, just in case someone has a question. Then, if someone can help me, if you see a hand waving, rather than my going searching for that face or hand.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask now, or you can post them in the chat, and we'll make sure that Reza can get to them.
I have a question, Reza.
Please.
My dear friend.
Please.
you haven't touched on the Lebanese population, I think, in the state, and that's a whole nother interesting issue here too. So what background do you have with that sort of knowledge?
Mhm. Thank you, Karen. I think Lebanese Americans are not the only community I'm leaving behind. I know, I'm aware that I've not covered everyone, but the Lebanese American community really needs special attention. So thank you for your thoughtful question. For the simple fact that such a small community have done so much for Maine. The majority leader of this country at one point, Senator George Mitchell, is of Lebanese origin. His mother came as an immigrant, and his father, he's talked about this, he's written about this. And so they struggled. And same thing is true about a few other national political leaders. The whole family, the clan of the Sununis in New Hampshire, John Sununu, the chief of staff for President Bush Sr., his son is the governor of state of New Hampshire, and the former governor's husband, Jean Shaheen, a Lebanese. So for a small community, they have done so much for Maine. And of course, Waterville, to this day, it happens to have a significant community of Lebanese American. Yeah. So again, there are so many other groups that I could have mentioned. So thank you for that question. So if there are no other questions, if I may, I want to read something very short. And so many of you, I assume, are quite familiar with Portland's streets and Forest Avenue, really kind of a main street in Portland, endless. It never ends. It's like Route 1 in a way. And so I wrote this a year ago, and if I may, I want to read it. When passing through certain sections of Portland's Forest Avenue, I imagine it being haunted, crowded with the ghost of a past we rather forget, a past when Portland's immigrants faced overt discrimination, intolerance, and violence rooted in nativism. Almost a century ago, right on Forest Avenue, where a Burger King fast food joint is located, stood a large building, the Rollin Estate, that served as the Ku Klux Klan's headquarters. During the opening ceremony of the KKK headquarters in 1924, 3,000 Klansmen showed up. Under a burning cross, new members were initiated that day. In Maine, since there were not that many African Americans, the Klansmen targeted the immigrants, the Roman Catholic, Irish and Italians, Jews, the Chinese, in addition to the Blacks. To them, if the residents' race, religion, and ethnicity was different, they were unfit to be Americans, not wanted in Maine. By some accounts, local newspapers used to include the announcements of the KKK public events, seen as family-friendly and normal, in their social page. Hooded men participated in marches in Portland and some cities and towns across the state. This was happening in the same era when, according to the national media, Jewish tourists and visitors were denied accommodations by resorts and hotels. A century later, same Forest Avenue, albeit now dealing with the congested traffic, happens to be where most immigrants owned and immigrant-run properties and businesses are concentrated. With Karma, in a stretch from the same Burger King to the Bessie Merrill corner are bakeries, nail salons, restaurants, Thai, Chinese, Somali, Iraqi, Mexican, Afghan, Vietnamese, a tax preparation office, Iraqi, Somali, Vietnamese, and Cambodian grocery stores, a car dealership, mechanic shops, among others, owned and managed by Maine's recent immigrants. And the ghosts of Maine's troubled history with immigration must gasp in surprise to witness the transformation of the landscape. And yesterday's collective fear and hatred of the other to hope and acceptance. The fun fact: immigrants bring prosperity to the community they join, be it now or before. And don't let anyone tell you that's a ghost story isolated to Portland's Forest Avenue. It is the central plot of the American story. For unless we belong to a Native American tribe, we are all immigrants. So it looks like I have 6 minutes. I would like to share a quick power presentation. I have to stay faithful to my background as an educator. When we teach, we love to do that. Any opportunity to show a PowerPoint presentation. And so just bear with me while I get to share the screen. And then we could continue. So here. So you should be able to see. Can you all see it? You can show me your hand. Yeah, thank you. So we're going to go through these. We talked about Wabanaki people being the first people of Maine. Forgive me if you find this harsh. This is what makes America great. The Germans in Maine. What many people in Maine have not heard, that the US government, in fact, used House Island, located off the Portland coast in Casco Bay, to process the overflow immigrants arriving in New York. St. Peter's School, Lewiston, class of 1910. And this is really interesting. You remember how I was talking about French-speaking families forcing the children to give up speaking French? There was a law in 1919 which banned speaking French in public schools. And poor kids had to write, "I will not speak French in a school," repeatedly. That was a punishment. Muslims in Maine, starting in the 1880s, Pepper Mills Company wasn't the only one, but that was really where most Albanian Muslims were recruited to work there. The reason being that back then the Albanian Muslims were really the best designers, textile designers in the world. So they didn't come really to work as workers, but they were textile designers. And to this, so there was this vibrant Muslim community in Maine in 1920s. And once the infamous Spanish flu arrived in Maine, the community vanished. All it remains of that community, the early Muslims in Maine, is a few dozens gravestones in a cemetery tucked behind the gas station. I've taken my student, I teach this immigration course at USM, and I take my students there to visit the cemetery. And that's again such a paradigm shift, because many Mainers assume that Islam arrived in Maine with the arrival of, for example, Somalis. And then we have to remind them that actually in 1880s, there were Muslims in Maine. And in the United States, if you want to know, 16th century, the first few Muslims who arrived go back to 1660s. And the Muslims who actually participated in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War, and so on. The first Armenian immigrants came in 1896 because of the persecution that they were facing in Turkey. I love this picture. The Maine Historical Society has these. It's two brothers from two Armenian brothers, Zakarians. There used to be these courses, Americanization course being taught. And here's another fascinating human history, that there was this Jewish family in Calais, Maine, and Sarah lost her husband. So she and her three sons, pictured here, managed to continue to have this textile business in Calais, clothing store, I should say. So the order would come from New York, and she would sell it in Calais, Maine. And because there were no other Jews in that community, this is where it gets really so gorgeous. She would invite the drivers or people who came delivering the goods, if they would stay, so there would be 6 of them to do the Jewish prayers together. Because isn't that, I love that story. So tough women. And this is the couple I was talking about, the Chinese couple. And the goons. And so there was, Mr. Goon got into some trouble. At one point, he was going to be deported out of the country. And then he reminded, when he went to see a judge, he reminded them that he had actually served in the US Army. And that's a picture of him in the US Army uniform in 1980. Portland City Directory advertisement, 1871. Maine Historical Society has these. See an ad for a Chinaman's tea store. Of course, now we are decent and we don't use terms like that. Single man in Augusta, Maine. Another single man in Augusta, Maine. Then this is the gentleman who became a police officer in Lewiston. He made waves. First Greek police officer in Maine. And here is Zahra Abu, the Somali young woman fresh out of University of Southern Maine, being shown as a police officer in Portland, Maine. Disturbing pictures of the KKK marchers and in a different community in Sanford area. And the Native American Party, the Know Nothing Party, America First. Do you hear the echoes of the past in contemporary America as I talk about this? America First, let's make America great and all that. That sense of nativism, that sense of that people who don't look like me don't belong here, go home, all that. So we have a history with that, sadly. And every now and then it resurfaces, this xenophobia, this fear of other. On a painting of the Old South Church and another Klan rally in Portland in 1926. For a period in the mid-1920s, the KKK members who were so active in the Maine Republican Party managed to even elect a governor. Was very, very either Klan man or was very supportive. Anti-Jewish discrimination widespread among summer resorts in Maine, 1938. American Jewish Congress charges some Maine hotels, 1951. Bangor synagogue being vandalized. Anti-Semitism sermon titled, this was not that long time ago. I was here, I was in Maine when this happened. I was also in Maine when in 2002, former Lewiston mayor wrote a letter which sadly brought us some negative attention. And this is a time when we need families to come to Maine to work here. And an act of Islamophobia in Lewiston in 2006. So regardless of one's religion. One day it's the Roman Catholics, another day it's the Jewish faith tradition, next it's a Muslim. We seem to find a target. Former Maine Governor Paul LePage says asylum seekers bring diseases like HIV and Zika fly, which to this date nobody knows, but Zika fly. This was reported sadly internationally and nationally in 2016. The same gentleman mocked Bulgarian and Indian workers in speech, saying they need an interpreter. As you see, this made it to New York Daily News. This happened around the time that there were some foreign investors looking at Maine, trying to bring some industries, creating jobs, and these are the kind of language that we never need. We don't need. We don't need to dehumanize immigrants. And then this is the positive news, that how soccer makes refugees Americans. So there is a documentary, if you find time, look it up online, and the soccer team in Lewiston made it to the state championship in thanks because of the immigrants being part of the team. To me, that is the America I fell in love and left everything familiar behind to come to this country. And I've never regretted that decision. This is part of the exhibition that I co-curated in the Maine Historical Society. More information, 4% of Maine residents are immigrants, while 7% of residents are native-born US citizens with at least one immigrant parent. I could show you more data, but the good news is Maine MultiCultural Center, I'm pleased to report, their website has lots of wonderful information. I wanted to thank again and again the board members, all of you who are active with the Maine MultiCultural Center, that please, thank you, and please continue the good work. And in fact, I'm honored that you invited me to be part of this. So there's another myth that today's immigrants don't want to become citizens. That's not true. 52% have become citizens despite the barriers. And one of the things that I do in my new job at the Greater Portland Immigrant Welcome Center, as part of our civic engagement and citizenship, we help qualified citizens, non-citizens to become naturalized citizens. Whether the barrier is language or financial, we're there to support them. And talk about immigrants, workforce that we need in Maine, our aging population, the young, the highly educated. And I'm going to stop here, but this is one example that 16.4% of New Mainers have a bachelor degree, versus 15.2 for native-born citizens of Maine. And then you get to graduate degree, it is 17.4 immigrants versus 7.9 for American-born citizens of Maine. 25% of all the physicians in the United States are now foreign-born, first generation. We're not even including the second generations. And that's what we need in Maine. With your help, we're going to make that happen. We're going to be an accepting state for all those who arrive here in Maine as immigrants, asylum seekers, the world's displaced people, so on and so forth. Thank you so much.
Just mute. Mute.
I have to warn you, if you don't ask questions, I'll continue to talk.
Can I, if I don't ask a question, can I just make major comments? I mean, you and I have been friends since like the early 90s, Reza.
Whatever. We
With our
met in
work with,
kindergarten, by the way. We met in kindergarten.
yeah, we're about that old. And we did a lot of work with Amnesty International for many years. And during that time too, I also taught ESL to a lot of asylum seekers and immigrants from Africa. And then I also taught ESL to some children who are from Asia, the Middle East, Southern America, South America, and Africa. And if I knew French or Spanish, I would always speak it to them. And they did not want me to talk in their native language, but I felt like they needed to have it and just realize that it's something that you need to come to terms with. So I know that sounds probably like a weird white lady problem, but you and I, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of torn here. I'm so like, I want to cry because you and I have come so far, Reza, I mean, I knew you from early on. And so anyway, it really means a whole lot to me, everything you've done for people since then. And that it just makes my soul feel good. So
Thank you. Thank you.
I love you.
I love you all. Thank you. I love you, Carol. Thank you.
Are we on?
Thanks.
Can you hear me, Reza?
Of course I do. Yes, yes.
Oh, good. I wondered if you'd tell us more about the kinds of things that go on at the center that you're in charge of. What is the daily activities when people come to your center? What happens?
Well, the reality of it, sadly, we're in the middle of the pandemic, in case you haven't heard.
Oh, yeah.
So officially, we're closed to the public, but people stay in touch with us, sending us emails, phone calls, leave us messages. And so a normal day, if it were not for the pandemic, it would be that recent immigrants or some who lived here for a while would come to us and ask us to support them to start businesses. That's good news. That's good news for all of us. Immigrants, our research shows that immigrants are more likely to start businesses than native-born Americans. And by doing so, they create jobs for Americans, the job creators. So they come and ask us to help them to start businesses. They're new to this country, to this new culture, to this new way of doing business. Some want to expand their businesses. So others would come to us with questions about how to become a citizen, so our civic engagement and citizenship program really works with immigrants to help them to become civic leaders in their own communities. And that's, again, good news for all of us. We don't want them to be isolated. We don't want them not to learn English. We also have a digital language lab. We, with that lab, we help local employers and businesses. And by the way, thanks to Zoom, companies in Bangor could also work with us, or institutions, or organizations. So the companies in the southern part of the state, and they hire non-English speaking employees, immigrants, and then they do a contract with us, and we help them not only with language, by the way, but in terms of work safety, customer service. So the software that we purchase, the content can be adjusted. So also we have a business hub. We are about workforce integration. We recognize that the future of this state depends on how well we could integrate the newcomers and get them to be integrated into the workforce. I would maintain that integration is a two-way street. So at times we only expect immigrants to learn English, which we should. We expect them to do this, that, become citizens. But successful integration model is a two-way street. We should also help them to own a sense of ownership, to feel belonged, valued, and offer them a chair at the table. And if needed, change the design of the table.
I like
The
that.
point is workforce integration informs our work, regardless of which program. And for that, we feel good because we are helping the state of Maine, the very state we all love.
Reza,
Yes.
you mentioned Officer Petropoulos. When I was a young patrol officer, he had passed away, and they asked us on the police department if we would want to volunteer to be pallbearers for his funeral. So I was a pallbearer for his funeral.
Wasn't that in 1972, sir? I think in 1970.
Yes, and I came on the department in 1969.
Wow.
Then just to talk about young French Canadian kids. When I was 10 years old, we moved from Lewiston, Maine to Southern California. We were out there 14 years. So when I came back, the friends I had up until the age of 10 couldn't speak French, didn't want to speak French. And I kept my French with my parents, and I couldn't understand it. But they didn't want to be labeled dumb Frenchmen.
Mm-hmm.
And I never experienced that, having been raised away from Lewiston.
Mm-hmm.
French was my first language, and as it was for my friends, and you know, they could hardly speak French. Another thing too is, you know, discrimination. Back when I was serving as mayor of Lewiston, I used to write a column in the Twin City Times called Mayor's Corner. And I would often write about our Somali community. And I talked about the similarities that the Somalis were experiencing with the French Canadian experiencing. And I had French Canadian people mad at me for making that comparison. And as a matter of fact, I lost my 4th election for mayor because of my support for the Somali community. And, you know, as we now have a Somali city councilor in Lewiston, and at the time I was saying that in 30 years, within 30 years, we would have a Somali mayor in Lewiston. And I still firmly believe that. So we've got, I think, another 9 years before we have a Somali mayor in Lewiston.
Mr. Gilbert, I just recognized you. I thought you lived in Florida during the winter months.
I'm in Florida currently. I'm currently in Florida.
You are my favorite. You have been my favorite mayor. You did for the Somali immigrants. And I don't know if you remember me. We have met a couple of times.
Oh, yes. I remember you very well.
So now you've done so much for the community that you inspire me. Thank you for all you've done for immigrants. And we appreciate all that you've done. The moment
you've inspired me over the years.
We can go back and forth, but you're very good. Thank you. Man.
I see there's also a former city councilor, mayor of Lewiston, and a current state representative that's watching here, Kristen Cloutier.
Oh yes, of course. Yes. Well, thank you. Many ways, this is like coming back home. So any other questions? We still have, Michael, you have a question?
Yes, I do. I have an observation as well as a question. My observation is that I think the single most huge barrier that I observe for an immigrant to succeed is being able to speak English. That without English, you are really lost Um, I've also observed, because I have a friend, I'm friends with a man who is the head of his 3-generation family who came here about 3 years ago. His children are picking up English pretty well. His grandchildren are, of course, young school children, are speaking English incredibly well. And he hardly speaks a word of English. And our friendship is based upon hand gestures, body English, and Google Translate. But the hard part of this is that as a result of this, except for very occasional times when he sees some Arabic speaking friends, he is completely isolated. The American experience for him is that he is no longer in Damascus, where his home was bombed. He is safe. But other than that, this has got to be a very sad and lonely experience for him. And what I've noticed is that his access to English education is essentially through adult ed classes. And frankly, when he sits in and I have been to class with him, he sits in class with several other people. They're wonderful people, but they all speak different languages, and they have a teacher who's trying to help them speak English, and it is an enjoyable, minimally helpful education, if at all. And so with the Immigrant Welcome Center and the Maine Multicultural Center, I'm wondering what else is available to immerse a person like this, or to help a person like this overcome this hurdle. I see a lot of opportunity for him if he can navigate his way in this country with English, and I see virtually no opportunity for him without, and the services that I see available feel to me like they're marginal at best.
And also, thank you for that question, and also the fact that all the adult ed programs that I have come across or dealt with, they all have waiting lists. So there are fewer resources. The need is larger than the services we have. But it goes back to the generosity of Maine residents, individuals such as yourself, and they are taking it upon themselves to meet with new Mainers and help them to not feel isolated and help them to teach them English. So I always go back to the model of neighbor helping neighbor. We encourage that. If there's anything that our center can do in case of this gentleman, please drop me a line or let me know, and we'll see what we can do. But perhaps this can be something for the Maine Multicultural Center to discuss, that creating a group of volunteers who are willing to meet with new Mainers to help them learn not only the language, but they would also learn about the new country. And so I want to thank you for not only raising this but also helping this gentleman.
Sign me up to help.
There you have a volunteer. There you go. Marwa, you have a question, please.
Myself. So I don't know where your friend is located, Michael, but there are resources like the literacy volunteers. And, you know, I have been heavily involved with the literacy volunteers of Bangor, and especially pre-COVID, there is a lot of one-on-one help. There's a ELL track as well as just a basic literacy track. And I know that we have, you know, very, you know, like new beginning ESL, ELL language learners in all different levels. So that's, you know, something that you can look into. I know that now in times of COVID, there's a lot of virtual meetings. So that's something that that you can look into as well for your friend. And Pam said, I think Pam agreed that the literacy volunteers, especially here in Bangor, they're extremely active.
Perhaps one of you two could put your email in the chat, and that would at least let me touch base and take some of this information and get it in more detail and then follow it up rather than have the whole audience watch me get educated here.
Yeah, and better yet, I will send you the email for one of the directors of this program.
Marwa,
Yes.
to follow up on that for Reza to know and others that are watching, is that in April, Mary Taylor, who is the head of Literacy Volunteers, is going to be our speaker. So for those,
excellent. Okay.
yeah, so
Good
for
timing.
those who are interested
She's
in
confirmed.
saying, she will be it's I can't remember the exact date, but you could talk to John Falk about getting on the list and he would help you get the notification.
Can I follow up?
Next question.
Could I follow up this with one question? How long, in your experience, does it take a middle-aged person who comes here without English skills to feel comfortable in this country, or does the comfort level in this country arrive in the succeeding generations and not with the first generation who's over here?
It's a difficult question to answer. There are many, many variables here. One being, if the person is suffering from trauma, that's going to take longer time. Also, of course, the age is an issue. But more importantly, I think some of ESL, I see one person, ESL instructor listening in. One factor would be if they are literate in their own native language, because there are immigrants who arrive in this country who are illiterate in their own countries. Perhaps their lives were disrupted, they spend years in refugee camps, there are these gaps in their lives. And so if they are illiterate, that's going to take a bit longer. So there are all these factors, and one's worldview that if they're happy here, if they want to succeed. But yes, their children and their offspring would pick up the language. It's a generational problem that in fact creates some tension between the parents who are taking longer time to not only learn English, but learn America, how to be American. Yeah. And the children who have no problem in learning the language and learning the culture and joining the American pop culture even. So there are many, many factors, but one shouldn't give up. I've seen some people who had suffered from isolation coming back and doing really well. The other issue is really, it goes beyond language. It's a social isolation. So we recommend that communities such as yours create social opportunities. For example, here in Portland, Maine, we organized the end of Ramadan celebration, the Eid al-Fitr. We do iftar dinners. That's the evening meal that you break your fast. And in doing so, we're not trying to convert anyone to this religion or that religion. What we're doing, we're creating social opportunities for some, in particular, the elderly members of the community, to get a chance to meet others and also meet people from host communities. So we do that by the way, for the Buddhist. And so these are, again, there are so many ways that you could help your community members to come out of their so-called shells and meet other people, and then friendships are made, and in no time it leads to that whole issue of social isolation being resolved. Yes, please, Dina. You had not joined us. We talked behind your back. That I love the story that they had about you in today's paper.
Thank you, Reza.
Proud of all you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
I
Yeah, and I apologize. I logged in later, like I missed some of the presentation, but I'm amazed with the piece that I heard, like how Maine was enriched with the many waves of immigrants who came. I'm like, I was amazed because you think it's Maine and not many came to Maine, right? But so it was really nice to hear that Maine has welcomed all of these immigrants over the years. So it's good to see that. My question is about how Portland, especially the Portland area, has witnessed many immigration waves in the last couple decades or so. And Portland has been able to keep up with resources, infrastructure. I know they're struggling with housing issues, but I mean, there are a good bus system, like adult education, learning languages, welcome immigrants like this center that you are the director of now. So there are so many resources. What would it take our area to be like where Portland is? And I'm not talking about Portland now, like 20 or 30 years ago when immigrants started to arrive to Portland. And obviously, I'm like, there is a system like to welcome all of these people. What does it take us in Bangor? It's just, it blows my mind how like where we are and where other towns are.
Yeah. I wish I had an easy answer, but the reality of it, as an immigrant advocate, I would love to see immigrants getting to go the other parts of Maine, because we need young families to move to parts of the state where the population decline is a very serious and it's critical. To go there and start families, raising the children. Schools would continue to have students. That means teachers would get paid. That means we could go on and on. But we could only encourage immigrant families. But there are also other concerns. Earlier, I talked about the bad news is that there are some anti-immigration sentiments in some parts of the state. We need to fight that. And by fight, I mean to really provide for accurate information. And we need to fight misinformation and fake news that would tell us that immigrants are here to welfare, here and they're a burden on the state's economy. So really changing the narrative that in fact we need them. And we are grateful they're here, by the way. Every immigrant I meet recently, newcomer, I thank them for coming to Maine because they could go anywhere else. Nothing stops them. So we should be grateful they're here. They've selected us to come and start a business or to work here. So I think proving to immigrants, the message would get, the word would get out. It happened in case of Lewiston, that the initial wave of Somali immigrants who came faced some opposition. I mentioned that infamous letter by the intolerant mayor. The point, but soon the Somalis felt so accepted and so valued that more arrived. The word would get around that this is a beautiful state. Maine is magical. And I say that in the middle of February, so that should mean something. But seriously, getting the word out that we are an accepting state, there are opportunities, and people would move. How long would it take? I don't know, but I have no doubt that in years to come, we would see immigrants everywhere in Maine, and more.
I think we're seeing it more and more. I grew up here in Bangor, and there were like no people of color whatsoever. So it's just such a delight to see people of different, ethnicities, different cultures, different religions. I'm starting to see it more and more. I moved away for many years, but I came back, and it's a wonderful thing to see. So it's happening. It is. You weren't here maybe back when I grew up here in the 70s, 80s. I don't want to tell the age, but it's changed so much. So good job.
I think I'm not patient enough to like, I still see the waves of immigrants coming to Portland, like every summer, like, why don't they come our way? Like,
it will happen. I promise you, many of us are impatient. We want that to happen tomorrow. And it will happen. I mean, all of a sudden now we have a thriving Iraqi community in Augusta, Maine. Who would have thought? So it is a spreading across. And then Maine MultiCultural Center, I would argue, could play a significant role in attracting and retaining. Retention is also important.
So we have been talking, Maine MultiCultural Center and welcoming immigrant neighbors here in the Bangor area have been talking and have talked to Catholic Charities as well, trying to do an asset. We've done an asset map of the area, trying to figure out what it is we need. We're done with the asset map, and now I think it's a question of building partnerships and pulling together the resources that are here in the Bangor area, and maybe doing some education about how those resources could be deployed, in support of immigrants in the area. So we think that it will be maybe another year or so before the systems that Trump destroyed for bringing in immigrants to the area are in place again, and kind of the pipeline is open again and flowing in the way that it was before. And so that gives us a little time to prepare. And we're hoping that by the time that happens, we'll be in a position to have an up and running welcoming center that works on multiple levels, not just helping with integrative services, but working with the community to make sure that the community is prepared to receive immigrants as well.
And thank you for that. And if we can be of any help, the Immigrant Welcome Center, in terms of really recommendations and lobbying for that to happen with Catholic Charities and others, please think of us as a partner. But it really takes takes a village. So you need the business community to be on board. You really need all the stakeholders to be on board. You have an amazing part that we don't have in Portland. You have the whole university system. All those foreign students were there. At one point, you had about 800,000. If you could convince 10% of them after they graduate to remain there, some of them are very bright engineers who are going to California to do that, to start that startup company. I know some of them personally. They go there and to Texas and to New York and Connecticut. If you could convince them that you could do that in Maine, but the government has to be on board, and the private sector and public sector. So you have a wealth of a concentration of really some wonderful people at the university system come for 4 years and then they leave. And by keeping some of them, convincing them to stay, you might win some other native-born kids who are also leaving the state, to our dismay. Young people in Maine were born in Maine and have lived here for generations and leaving other cities. And people would say, in search of better opportunities. I would respectfully disagree. They are going where multicultural communities are. So if you could create that multicultural community in Bangor, some of them might not leave, some would leave. So you see, it is a win-win situation for all. It takes some work. It's the business community being open. If an immigrant wants to go and start a grocery store, to help them to access loans, basically what we do in Portland, the Immigrant Welcome Center.
I'm sure we'll be talking some more with you. Thank you.
We would welcome that.
Thank you.
Okay, let's give a big hand to Reza for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for this link to Portland. We are so interested in what you're doing. You're such a good role model for us. And anybody that is still here, could you take a second and click on the link in the chat box for the evaluation? That would be helpful for us if you could do that. And thank you all for coming. We appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to listen and learn. So, Reza, could you just throw your address to me in the chat box? So I want to make sure you get your honorarium.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Also, I wanted some shameless promotion of my upcoming book, which is about years, and it's called Dear Maine. It in fact has the story of Sophia Khalid. Larry was referring to her, the youngest member of the city council in Lewiston of Somali origin. And it has stories of all these immigrant leaders who call Maine home. This is my second book related to issue of immigration. The first one was New Mainers, came out in 2009, and this is coming out in September 2021. I'm one of the co-authors. So please get a copy of the book. If educators among you use the book as a textbook. I have used it for my class, and I would love to come back and do a reading, by the way. I'm inviting myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.